Hello, everybody. Can you first of all hear me? Absolutely clearly. Thank you so much for coming on, which is not perhaps the very finest day that Hay has ever yet seen. It may not be the worst that Hay will ever see. But anyway, thank you so much for coming in such numbers. And I'd like to say I can promise you a treat over the next 60 minutes. I sincerely hope you will be in for a treat over the next 60 minutes. I'm Paul Cartledge. I'm the A.G. Leventis Professor of Greek Culture in the University of Cambridge, and it's my very great privilege and pleasure to be in conversation today with an extraordinarily gifted and talented and extremely energetic author. Now, is your mic working?
I don't know.
Yeah,
Can you hear
okay.
me? Yeah, so I'm not meant to talk now.
Adam Nicholson, who is a multi-award-winning and multi-authoring person. And of his previous books, I asked him just before we came on, what would he be most keen for you to read or for his legacy to be remembered for? And it's a book called Sea Room, which came out in 2001, and perhaps this will come up. When you read this book, I don't say if, when you read his latest book, you'll find a lot about the sea in it. He's particularly interested in nautical matters. And the other of his books that he would recommend most strongly for you to consider is the book he wrote about the making of the King James Version, or the King James Bible. Came out in 1611, and that was called Power and Glory, the Making of the King James Bible, or in its US version, God's Secretaries. And so he covers the waterfront, if I can put it that way. Now, what we're planning to do is have a little chat, and you are going to be listening in to begin with. And then we wish you also to participate and to join in the broad conversation. You know what the book is called. I'm sure you all know that it is a quotation from John Keats. What you will not necessarily yet know is why Adam wrote it, why he thinks Homer does matter, as opposed to why he or I or you might think that Homer should still matter. He starts off, I think, a little dispiritingly by saying that he thinks Homer no longer occupies the central place in Western culture that he either once did or probably still should occupy. I actually think that that's perhaps a little pessimistic. I think probably all of you here have had some direct access to Homer, if only in a translation, at some stage of your life. And I'm just going to start off autobiographically. I'm then going to ask Adam to start off autobiographically by telling you that the reason I'm standing here is because of Homer. When I was 8, I read a little book, and it was called Told to the Children, and it was both Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey. And there is a famous passage in the Odyssey. Odysseus has got back finally, after 19 or so years, to his rocky islet, Ithaca. And he's still in disguise, but he has made himself known to one of his faithful former servants, a slave, a man called Eumaeus, his pig keeper, swineherd. And Eumaeus is taking him to the palace, back to his own palace, which has been besieged for many, many years by 108 suitors. And outside the palace, as it were, back door, Odysseus in disguise sees an old dog, a very, very old dog, tick-ridden, stiff in the joints, lying on top of the offal, the refuse that is pushed out of the kitchen from the palace, the offcuts from the feasting that's continuously going on in the palace. Odysseus recognizes his dog, called Argos, swift, and he says to Eumaeus, That dog is in a very poor circumstance. Was he always like that? And Eumaeus gives what is a kind of honorific CV of what had been Odysseus's favorite hunting dog. Argos, being a dog, though he's nearly blind, recognizes Odysseus instinctively by smell, wags his tail, and then Homer says his heart within him burst, and he rolled over and died. And Odysseus discreetly, he turns away, sheds a tear. Well, I was 8. I howled for 30 minutes. But quite seriously, that is the moment, if I'm to look back, at which I thought, well, yes, maybe there is something in these old texts. And of course, Homer is the absolute oldest work of Greek literature, therefore the oldest work of classical Greek or Roman literature that we possess. So now it's my great privilege, I'm going to turn over to Adam, who will say a bit about his own background, how he came to write this book, and then we'll talk about why and how it still should and does matter. Thank you.
Well, it is a huge, huge pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming on this truly appalling day. I've driven from Sussex this morning, and it was honestly like Odysseus setting off across the wildest parts of the storm-tossed Mediterranean. And so it's brilliant we're all here. And I want to thank you, Paul, because obviously a professor of Greek at Cambridge, if you're thinking of writing a book about Homer, is easily the most terrifying person on earth. And it's taken years and years to write this book, largely because I've thought of Paul thinking, no, that's not right. And so the fact that he's here is truly wonderful. It is slightly like sitting in the lion's den, but he's a very, very nice lion. I might easily call him Argos. He has been wagging his tail at me. He wrote me a very nice email the other day saying, I absolutely love your book, marvelous, poetic, gripping, da-da-da. Here are the mistakes in it. So, I love you anyway. Okay, so...
Oh, it's completely mutual.
Now, why have I written this book? Well, as Paul said, I am of the age where we were made to do Greek effectively at school, and I, to be honest, absolutely hated it. Unlike, you're as told to children, we were made to pick through the Greek of one book of the Odyssey, line by line, word by word, and it was honestly like being confronted with a particularly spiny grouper that you had to pick the bones out of in order to find the flesh. And I thought I was always extremely bad at maths, and I felt this was like maths but worse. So I did Greek up to O level, as it was called, and then effectively abandoned it. And only many, many, many years later, I mean, I must have stopped, I think, when I was 15, having started when I was 9 at Greek, stopped at 15, and then when I was about 40, I was on a sailing trip, a big sailing trip with a friend of mine up the west coast of Ireland. And we knew it was going to be a wild and stormy affair. And I just threw rather randomly into my bag a copy of the Odyssey translated by the truly great American scholar, translator, poet, Robert Fagles. And after a grievously difficult journey to Ireland from Cornwall, I lay in my bunk, tied up to the quay in Roaring Water Bay we were in Baltimore, and started to read the Odyssey. And it honestly was a completely revelatory moment to me. One of the difficulties with something like Homer is that it looms or kind of presides in the background as a classic, a sort of great monumental thing like a giant library, or sort of a great object that isn't going to be warm or intimate or human. And I suddenly found, reading the Odyssey in Fegel's translation, that it was speaking to me not about Odysseus, but about my own life, about me as Odysseus, and that his whole sequence of storm-tossed journeys and then arriving at these wonderful islands of desire, occupied by delicious nymphs who would sleep with him for 7 years, even though he got slightly bored of it at one point, or wonderful dinners and comfort and beauty. So you have this endless oscillation in the Odyssey, sorry, between sort of exposure and enclosure, the experience of the rough, wild, difficult, threatening world. And then as another form of threat, the experience of these beautiful enclosing islands where you might just as well lose your way as on the open sea. And I read all this and I thought, my God, this is actually about me now. It isn't a great, distant, foreign, alien object. It's about the human condition. And it became for me, I was on a big trip all the way up the west coast of Ireland and on to the Hebrides and Faroes in the end. And I read it all that summer and started to see, I think, really why Homer has continued to mean what it has meant over the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. And I think the key element of that is intimacy, that it's close, which is a very odd thing for a monument to be. You're not held at a distance. It is an extraordinarily inviting set of experiences, really.
Perhaps I could just come in there and say, you've talked so far about the Odyssey,
yeah,
and it's quite obvious the direct connection between yourself being a traveller, storm-tossed, and the story of the Odyssey. But, of course, Homer was initially more famous for what we think is probably the first of it. Actually, the ancient Greeks thought Homer, whoever he was, wrote lots and lots of epics, not just two. Greek word epos means a word, so it's slightly interesting that the Greeks applied a word that means just word to a particular form of words, namely the epic hexameter, meter, long poem. But actually, I just wanted to ask you, how did you move then from the Odyssey back to the Iliad? Does the Iliad have a similar personal resonance for you? Could you see yourself as Achilles, dare I say?
No.
No, right. Oh, come on then.
But this is obviously the key question. And I think that the Odyssey is certainly an easy way into Homer, but the Iliad is nevertheless the core of Homer. The essential sort of Homeric place is in the Iliad. And I became very intrigued by Homer and went on to read the Iliad largely in English, but also finding my way with a dictionary and the very marvelous online Liddell and Scott, which I can recommend to anyone. It's the most miraculous thing.
Notice the online.
Online is really...
You were saying to me...
Well, I was saying this. Yeah. I very nearly called this book Homer, My Wife, because he's just sort of lived with me so intensely for the last 10 years or whatever. Very nearly, I called it Homer by EasyJet, because I could definitely not have gone to all the places that are in the book without lovely modern aeroplanes. And the third thing is Homer by online Liddell and Scott. It's just the most miraculous delivery system to understanding what the poem's about in their intimate sort of lexical texture and detail. But the point about the Iliad, to me anyway, it's a bit awkward saying these things in front of the professor, to be honest. I can't really tell the professor what the thing about the Iliad is, but anyway, I'll try.
I won't tell anybody else,
okay.
Don't worry. No.
Clearly the Odyssey was written with the knowledge that the Iliad already existed. The two poems it's sort of almost a yin and yang relationship. The Iliad is here, and the Odyssey sort of fits around the Iliad, tells stories that really should be in the Iliad, refer to things, knows what's happened there, never repeats what's in the Iliad, but kind of just fills in the landscape around it. And the two poems are kind of conceptual opposites and a conceptual pair. So the Iliad is all about destiny and fate and singularity and the kind of the fixity of the human condition, that you're fixed into this grievous, unending, apparently, war. There is no escape from it. The phrase that W.H. Auden had for the Iliad was the tragedy of necessity, that this is a world of pain which is inescapable. It's just an aspect of who we are as people, that we fight, we struggle, we suffer, we die, we are forgotten, unless by chance we're raised up into this magical realm of epic, which is epic is the great memory mechanism or memorial mechanism, where somehow time is always winnowing away the reality of our lives, and they will just fade back into the dust. But epic itself can somehow make heroism or lives or individuals last. And it's absolutely central to Homer to kind of know that.
Can I just pick up on one aspect?
Yeah.
You're quite right about memory, quite right about pain, which we're going to come back to. But there's a famous passage. Achilles is, of course, extremely upset with the way his commanding officer, Agamemnon, has treated him. He has robbed him, as Achilles sees it, of his favorite partner, female partner, herself a prisoner of war. So he skulks, as we say, or sulks, in or outside his tent. But he's outside his tent when Odysseus, the hero of the next epic, comes along with a delegation to try to persuade him to abandon his skulking and sulking and to get back into armor and fight. And what's he doing? Well, he's strumming some sort of stringed instrument outside his tent. And what's he singing? He's singing the famous deeds of men. And Greek has, like English, of course, both a gendered sense of men and also the mankind, a non-gendered sense. Well, he means it in the gendered sense. He means men like him. Only men can achieve the kind of glory and fame because it's in war. And in Greek, the word for courage literally means virility or masculinity. It actually wasn't possible for a woman to be brave in the same sense as a man, that is, in warfare. So it's a very particular take on what it is to be famous and to have achieved something. And I wonder.
But what about Penelope?
Well, I was just going to go and say, you were saying that the Odyssey and the Iliad are, as it were, complementary, and I'll come back to there's one particular way in which they are. You don't learn about the fall of Troy in the Iliad, which is quite extraordinary if you think about it. The poem's called the Iliad, which means a poem about the city of Troy, but Troy doesn't fall at the end of the Iliad. Where does it fall? In the Odyssey. So they're complementary in that sense. But what I was getting at is one 19th century critic thought that the Odyssey was written by a woman because it's so much more woman-friendly, whereas I'm afraid the Iliad is extraordinarily masculinist and sexist. So I was going to ask you whether you thought...
In the Iliad, you have the wonderful description of Hera getting dressed, for example. Wow. And you have the figures of Andromache and Helen, who are utterly noble, beautiful, dignified figures. On the one hand. On the other hand, there's a set of chariot games at the end of the Iliad, and there's a discussion of prizes. And as far as I remember, a woman as a prize, I think, is worth 3 tripods, is that right?
Probably.
And a good ox, something like that. So you can choose. It's like the generation game, if any of you remember that. So as they go past you, says, "I'll have that girl." Oh no, I think I'll have the ox. Anyway, yeah, so it's not entirely true that the Iliad is indifferent to the virtues of women.
No,
Is
fair
it?
enough. Well, let me go back then to the other point that I was going to make, which is about pain. If you read Adam's book, the first 20, 30 pages or so, the word pain or painful recurs terrifically. And so is there a tension, I was going to ask you, in your view, between, on the one hand, the celebration of glorious deeds, which are presumably thought to be positive, even though they very often involve men treating women extremely badly, as well as treating other men pretty roughly. This is war, and war is not pretty in Homer's view. But is it the case that Homer, whoever he was, is particularly keen to get across a message to us about pain, how that is an inseparable, indeed central, part of the human condition? Or is that just, as it were, collateral damage? If you're involved in war, people are going to suffer and die, so there's pain. How far is pain absolutely a defining element of what it is to be human, or simply a side product of the fact that the Iliad's mainly about war?
Well, that is a really interesting question. I think you have to distinguish between Homer, i.e. the poems themselves, and the characters within them. I think that maybe the Achilles view, for example, is the one I was just talking about before, that life is a struggle, it's absolutely drenched in pain. War is the theatre in which that condition is most acutely dramatized, and maybe the glory is a price, the pain is a price worth paying for the glory.
Right.
But at the end of the Iliad, there is this wonderful and completely subversive moment when the old king of Troy, Priam, who is grieving terribly, like the rest of the city, over the death of his favorite son, Hector, who's been killed by Achilles, and Achilles famously has dragged his body around the walls and then taken the body back to the Greek camp. And the poem, rather than ending with the sort of brutal Greek triumph at Troy, which appears most bloodily in the Aeneid later, that's the sort of most ghastly description of it. The poem effectively ends, or the sort of emotional ending, with Priam very carefully piling up on a series of carts all the most beautiful, civilized things that Troy can offer. And a lot of them are beautiful cloths, which are woven by the women of the city. And there is a very, very deep tension and difference in the Iliad between the woven, which is essentially a Trojan characteristic, the tying of things together, the making of the integrated whole, the city itself even as a woven, a made woven thing, and the severed, the cutting bronze, the sharp bronze, which is essentially a Greek characteristic. And so I think you can see the whole poem as a drama of the woven and the severed. And at the end, or very nearly at the end of the Iliad, Priam takes these cloths across the battlefield at night, a sort of dark and mysterious journey, almost as if he's going down into the underworld, guided by Hermes, the great messenger god, and arrives at Achilles' tent. And Achilles, of course, is dumbfounded that the father of all these men that he and other Greeks have killed in the course of the previous 9 years should be there at all. The courage of it and the sort of, I think, almost the kind of Mandela-like breaking of categories that goes on in that moment. That Priam, instead of thinking of enmity and pain as the essential dynamic of this, is actually saying, no, the essential dynamic of this is jointness. And they very symbolically eat together, hold hands together, and come to agree that Priam can take his son, the body of his son, back to the city where he's given a due and proper burial. And so I think that the Iliad in the end, steps outside the dynamic that has made it work for the vast body of it.
I think that's exceptionally perceptive. There is just one thing I would add, which is that Priam kisses Achilles' hands. And Homer uses very often, as you know, an adjective plus a noun, which doesn't always fit the situation perfectly. But in this case, it absolutely does. He kissed Achilles' man-slaying hands. So not only, of course, Hector, but Achilles had killed many others. But the reconciliation was quite extraordinary. Now, what I'd like to go on from in that respect is, in your book, you draw a very strong contrast, as you have just in your oral presentation, between the Greeks and Troy. And of course, there's two fundamental distinctions. One is Troy is the object of the exercise. It's the potential victim, and it's stable. Whereas the Greeks are very sort of unstable, and they've come together, which is quite unusual for Greeks to do anything together. But their principal fighter has withdrawn from the fighting for a long time. So there's a bit of a message there, I think, about how disunity, if nothing else, prolongs campaigns quite extraordinarily. Had Achilles taken on Hector in the first year of the siege, then you wouldn't have had a 10-year siege, for example. So that's one thing. But you actually have a particular take, don't you, on what it is that, in your view, differentiates Troy.
Quite professorial at this point.
I'm being very professorial.
Yeah.
What for you Troy stands for, whereas the Greeks stand for something else. And very crudely, I'm going to put it in structuralist, binary, oppositional terms, the Greeks are the wild and the Trojans are the tame. The Greeks are the mobile, the Trojans are the fixed. And crudely, the Greeks are the relatively barbaric and uncivilized, as against the relatively civilized Trojans. I'm possibly caricaturing what you have written, but on there, would you like to just develop that a bit?
Yes. I mean, all the people who've reviewed this book so far have said Adam's been very, very brave about this, because this is really, I think, about where Homer comes from. And the conventional idea nowadays, or perhaps I could step back. I mean, we'll move into the history.
Bit of history.
Yeah,
that's what I thought. Yeah.
So the view of Homer through most of Western civilization has largely been that it happened at some time ago. No one's quite sure when. Maybe they're just poems. It's not a great agony about whether they're real or not. But then in the 19th century, the German businessman and incredible polymath, entrepreneur Schliemann thought that there must be a reality, and dug famously at Troy, cutting this huge sort of railway, cutting deep thing through, essentially destroying the whole of the Bronze Age history of Troy in doing so, and arriving at a very, very early level, something like 2300 BC in Troy, and found there the famous jewels of Helen that then he took back to Berlin, and then they were hidden by the Nazis in the war, was stolen by the Soviets, were hidden in Moscow for a long time, and can now be seen in the Pushkin Museum at last. And he also went to Mycenae and dug up those famous gold masks and many other wonderful treasures which are now in Athens. And so once he'd done that, and he claimed, well, he didn't use these words, but effectively he claimed that what he found at Mycenae was the Homeric world. And equally, the things he found at Troy, he claimed, were from Priam's Troy. And so for the early part of the 20th century, late 19th century, 20th century, people began to think that the Aegean world from, say, sort of 1600 to 1200-ish BC was the world that Homer was describing, and tried to fit that together. That picture fell apart just after the Second World War, partly through the discovery of the tablets in the Mycenaean palaces in Greece and Crete, showing that the Greek palace civilization hadn't been Homeric at all. It wasn't full of warriors. It was full of bureaucrats counting off sheep.
And staying awake as well.
And staying awake as well. Yes, and so then everybody has since then, really, I mean, this is as crude a picture, but since then has thought that Homer comes from a much later moment, in about the 8th century BC, when the whole of Greece, the whole of the Aegean area, experienced this extraordinary renaissance, when temples, the Olympic Games, cult sites like Delphi, new colonies, new kinds of ships, coinage, writing from the Near East, all of this kind of surged in a great creative moment in the 8th century. And it's when the first fragments of Homeric writing survive from. And so essentially the modern orthodoxy is when Homer was, and that is pretty well the world that Homer was describing. Or at least that was the world that generated the poems we now call Homer. Okay, that's what Paul thinks. I totally disagree.
Up to a point.
This is why I'm so brave, see. What I think is that, because what I think that 8th century idea that Homer is just a kind of poet of a boom does not really describe the kind of deep ethical dynamics of the poems. That in the poems you do have this very vivid, difficult, painful meeting of these two principles of life: the city-based, the wall-enclosed, the well-organized, the families together, people obeying their fathers, on the whole looking after their brothers, sometimes being a bit over-civilized, a bit affected. Paris is sort of a kind of dandy, and there are others with sort of golden chin straps and so on. But largely the city is seen as this wonderful sort of civilized, created whole. And on the other side, you have the Greeks, who are, at each other's throats, literally, rowing with each other, standing there saying, "There's nothing I want more than your blood to be on my blade." Saying, "Who are you? You're just a wine drinker. Your heart is as flaky as a deer," I think Achilles says to Agamemnon, doesn't he? And so I think that what you have there, in these two very deeply opposing principles, essentially the gang, fissive, wrong in many ways, and the city, coherent, whole, good in many ways, is a picture that fits exactly the historical situation of about 1,000 years earlier, about 1800 BC, when the people who would come to be the Greeks, all this is very difficult because there's almost no evidence of this, but from somewhere else,
out of his mouth.
It's true. Yeah. This is speculation, but I'll come on to why it's good speculation in a minute. The Greeks are certainly, the language is an Indo-European language. It certainly comes from a place further north, probably in the steppe lands of Asia, maybe from further east in Anatolia, somewhere the north, the Black Sea, Caspian Sea area, the steppes of that part of what is now southern Russia. Come down, those speakers of that language certainly come down to the Mediterranean around that time. And they are not city people. They do not build big buildings. They don't have public spaces. They don't have walled enclosures. They're mobile. They have bronze weaponry, horses. The chariot is probably invented there, not in the Near East. And they have this sort of dynamic, gang-like, raiding quality. And they come to the Mediterranean, and they find in the Mediterranean a deeply instituted city culture which runs all the way from Iraq now, and Egypt, through Anatolia, and Troy, the city of Troy, at this moment, about 1800 BC, is the northwesternmost walled city in the Mediterranean. If you were looking south from the steppe to the Mediterranean, Troy would be this kind of glowing lighthouse of riches. You know, if you were one of those raiders, you'd think, I'll have Troy, thanks very much. And I think that to see the Homeric poems emerging from that moment is to explain what they are. If you just think that they're some fantasy dreamt up by emergent small states without this grand meeting of cultures in the 8th century BC, there isn't nearly as much explanatory power in that. And I think that that's the phrase I come to, that this dating, this very, very early dating of the essence of Homer, of course it evolved and changed through the 1,000 years when it was transmitted orally. But the essence of that meeting, gang against city, woven against severed, coherent against broken, possibly good against possibly bad, is best located then and there.
Well, I'm prepared to accept that as a symbolic reading.
We could call it a day there. It's a triumph. That's the headline.
Right, you go. I'll now tell you the truth. No, there is no truth. But the essence, surely, of the Iliad is that there is a united, in some sense, united Greek expedition against one other city, which
united but fragmented.
Yeah, but you couldn't envisage Greeks getting into touch with each other, let alone collaborating with each other, until archaeologically you determine that there is some sort of homogeneous culture going on. And there are two indicators of that. One, Adam has mentioned, the tablets, which survive in palaces that were burnt, we don't know why or exactly when, in several centers in mainland Greece and on Crete, which represent the earliest form of the Greek language. The symbols are identical, whether in Chania, in Knossos, in Crete, or in Mycenae or Tiryns, or now Aios Vasilios, which is the Mycenaean Sparta, or Thebes, etc. So in other words, homogeneity of bureaucratic culture. Secondly...
Can I interrupt?
Yes. Please.
Nothing, I mean, as you say, a bureaucratic culture. What evidence is there in Homer of that existing?
Well, you can look at it, you see the exact other way, that it's all after, that Homer doesn't know about that. It's not that he's before it's happened, it's that his thought world is divorced from it because there's been a cultural rupture after that was the case. And I'll give you just one illustration. For Homer to have 50 slaves, fantastically rich. Well, if you look at the Mycenaean Linear B tablets, they had hundreds of slaves.
No, but Paul, I'm not saying that Homer is from the great palatial period of the Mycenaean civilization. It precedes that.
No, well, what I'm saying is the opposite.
Yeah, no, well, okay. It makes sense on either end.
It could be.
It makes sense on either. It doesn't make sense in the middle, in the bureaucratic middle.
No, absolutely. No. But what your problem is the plot.
Are any of you following this? This is like two bald men arguing over a comb, isn't it?
Well, that's one way that's one way to weasel your way out of this fact that you have no evidence to support your view whatsoever. No, but I mean, on my view, you are right. I do think the Homeric poems, and I stress that, they are selections, extremely intelligent, brilliant selections from a mass of oral tradition which has been circulating in the Eastern Mediterranean for hundreds of years. But what's always puzzled everybody, ever since they were created, is how do you get from, let's say I've got 2 hours with you, and I'm going to tell you the story of the duel between Hector and Achilles. Fine. How do you get from that to the Iliad? which is a selection from lots and lots of stories added together with a theme. And it starts out, the theme is announced in the very first line, meaning the anger of Achilles. Now, it's brilliant. That's why it doesn't end with the siege of Troy, because Achilles' anger is assuaged, as Adam poetically, brilliantly puts it, by the reconciliation scene with Priam. The conquest of Troy is for him secondary, but who thought of that? I think it takes an individual genius. The travels of Odysseus are much easier for a lesser intellect to conjure up, because it's one damn thing after another. It's a guy traveling from A to B via C, D, E, F, G, and having extraordinary adventures. Now, that doesn't take so much of a brain to think up, and it might very well be the same man who is following on from his genius of the Iliad. But just to stick with the very fundamental, I don't want to get into all the other dating problems. I mean, I actually did as a student.
We could offer they could leave if they want.
Yeah.
We could just have it.
I did a whole option as an undergraduate at a certain other university than the one that I am now representing, on what was called ridiculously Homeric archaeology. So you read all of Homer, and you found a passage in which there was a reference to an object. It might be a building, it might be a dagger, it might be a helmet, something objective that you could look at the archaeological evidence and say, well, that couldn't be before 1600 BC, it couldn't be after 800 BC, so that was the sort of thing. I spent a lot of time doing that. But all I'm interested in now is literary construction and conception, plot. I don't think Adam's Greece, mainland Greece, could have functioned in such a collaborative way. Not very, not totally, but not even as much as it does in the Iliad, much before 1300 BC. And I think you can give a very precise context to the date at which the notion of the Iliad was formulated. Now, the other thing, no, come on, one last thing. Comparative oral epic tells us that epic poets don't necessarily tell the truth for two reasons. One, they don't know the truth necessarily, and two, they couldn't give a damn about it because their job is to entertain. And if you accept my picture, after this period, 13th century, why were the palaces burned? We don't know. By whom? But what happened after we do know? Total cultural collapse for almost 2 centuries. No writing, no wall building, no fancy pottery, no lovely clothes.
Except Euboea.
Except until, for another couple of hundred years, Euboea. But it's in that period that the poets start thinking about how wonderful things once were. And if only we could get back to that, wouldn't it be better if we could have an Achilles who could go and rub the Trojans' noses in it? Well, anyway.
No, because, well, I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it, how addicted one becomes to one's theories.
Whoa! Theory. That's putting it a bit broadly for your mere speculation. Mine is a theory.
If it was essentially what you're saying is that it's an act of nostalgia.
Very well put. And of course, the Odyssey is literally that, because nostos means return.
No, but in the modern sense, a longing for a better world.
Yes, I agree.
But if you accept that in fact the Iliad is about a world of pain, and it provides in that wonderful resolution an escape from the world of pain, what a mysterious form of nostalgia for heroism that is. It doesn't really make sense that actually the position that Achilles holds, Homer, i.e. the poem, is horrified by the Achilles position. He doesn't adulate it at all. And I think we've talked about this before
between
I agree with
that. I think it's very acute.
That there's Homer has been misinterpreted over most of European history. Well, there's a good, careful remark, isn't it?
No hostages to fortune. No.
That most people have thought that Homer's description of violence in the Iliad is a kind of glorifying of that violence and an adulation of it. And Blake, William Blake, I know, said that Homer was responsible for most of the catastrophes of European history because the governing classes had this model in front of them. They named all their battleships after these heroes and so on.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, thought that this was the way to go. But I think that is a deep misinterpretation of Homer, that Homer dramatizes and displays the horror of that necessity and actually longs for an escape from it. It is not anti-war, because war is part of who we are. War, conflict, tension, violence is part of who we are. But he sees it as something tragic, a tragic aspect of human life. And there's this figure, Arte, I pronounce it in Greek. Is that ruin?
That's fine by me.
And ruin is, I have to check. Ruin is followed by these figures called the prayers. Now, in Christian, conventionality, the prayer is this immensely powerful and potent sort of mechanism to make the world or the universe better. In Homer, the prayers are these broken, crippled, stumbling, lost figures trudging in the wake of ruin across a sort of battlefield landscape. And I think that is a core bit of Homeric understanding, that ruin is powerful and prayers are crippled.
Now, I go along with that general point, which is one of the many insights and general points that you will get when you read this book. Just to give one illustration of what Adam is saying, somebody I've written about, Alexander the Great, is said to have so modeled himself on Achilles, not a very good role model, one would think, for a world ruler as opposed to a mere fighter. At any rate, that he had a copy of the Iliad which had been prepared for him and annotated for him by his former teacher Aristotle, the world's then greatest intellectual, the Western world, which he then took with him on campaign. He travelled all the way, as Adam was saying, way over to what's now Pakistan and Kashmir, and would sleep on this. Well, he is a massively controversial figure today. And insofar as he modeled himself, if he did, on Achilles, well then Homer does have to take a good deal of the responsibility for that controversy. Which,
what about George Bush?
What about George Bush?
Yeah, okay.
You tell me. Does he model himself on Alexander the Great or on Achilles?
Well, certainly on the kind of solution through violence.
Oh, yeah. That's the first resort, yeah. So do you think we're moving towards throwing it, as it were?
We have 12 minutes, 10 seconds left. Says here. So shall we have some questions?
Yeah. Who wants to throw the first brickbat?
Well, there are two people with microphones, so if we have two at once, the lady said, didn't we? So, and then there's a lady here.
Yeah.
Well, you're in charge.
Well,
you're in charge.
You can probably see better.
No, I can't. Actually, I'm half
I'm
blind.
having a little trouble with the visuals here.
Hello.
Yeah.
If you could say who you are,
hello,
or
my name's Louisa Young. I'm a novelist. I have been reading a couple of books by an American military psychiatrist called Jonathan Shea, called Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. And he works with Vietnam veterans and has written these books about the psychological state of the vets he works with, comparing it with the Iliad and the Odyssey, and comes up with the one idea I wanted to ask you two what you think about, of Achilles when going bonkers in his tent after the death of Patroclus. He recognises that as possibly the earliest ever example of combat stress, post-traumatic stress, shell shock, as it were. So what do you think about that?
Well, can I answer that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, I know those books. What I don't like about it is the sort of medicalization of Homer, that somehow the condition that those hundreds of people go through and the extraordinary variety of human experience in Homer is somehow symptomatic of illness. It is actually, it stands beyond that. And I think that, I mean, they're very interesting and very brilliant books, but I think that they are not the place to rest with Homer. Yeah. I think it's a tool. I think it's another word you can use for grief or horror, the nature of existence, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think that Auden's phrase about the tragedy of necessity actually reaches further into that condition than the medical version.
Yeah, I'd make 2 points. One is that, of course, Homer's fiction, and the second is that what you've got to take into account is not just the symptoms as described, divorced from a whole cultural complex, but you have to try to grasp the whole cultural complex. Mm-hmm. And you can do that in two ways. One is to try to imagine what the real world to which Homer was addressing himself was like, what their values were, how far there was continuity between the values of the epic and the values of real-life ancient Greece, whenever you think that real-life time was. And the other one is, of course, not to get too divorced from the fictionality, the context within which those descriptions are coming. And the other way is to look at things, well, what was going on before, I think probably the First World War, when shell shock was the phrase for what's now called combat stress or PTSD. Did no soldiers experience that before? Or if they did, was it culturally controlled and moderated in ways that did not have the same, as Adam says, medicalized attitude towards it? I would entirely agree.
And there's something else to say about that, which is that Achilles is there of his own decision. He is not in a recruit in a state-organized army. And I think that one of the things that's bedeviled the understanding of the Iliad is the notion that it's a meeting of states. It is not. It is a meeting of individual groups of warriors led by people in their groups from their different places, by people like Achilles.
Do we have another? Yes, someone in the middle here, please. Thank you.
This lady.
Thank you very much.
If we choose two at once, then we can
move
is there someone?
Yes, and then the lady in the front. But what? Is there another mic somewhere on this side? Down the front, please. Thank you. Sorry. If you could just stick your hand up. Yeah, thanks a lot. So, please.
I'm very interested by your structural analysis of the Iliad in this term of woven and cutting. I think it's very interesting. But I know you're reluctant to see the Greeks as bean-counting bureaucrats, which makes you uncomfortable about the timing of the tablets. I wondered, how do you fit Achilles' shield into that? Because the shield is a wonderful example of social counting. Everything's in rows.
Well, lots of answers. I mean, one of the things that you find in Bronze Age shields all across the whole Indo-European world, from Irish bogs to the steppes of Central Asia and down into southern Spain, and there are wonderful carvings of them in Estremadura, is a set of concentric circular rings like that, 4 or 5 of them. And that they're usually shown with the handle of the shield facing towards you, so that you are within this wonderful series of circular structures. And it is undoubtedly, to my mind, a kind of a cosmic idea that you live within these rings of wholeness. And one of the problems, another problem which bedevils the usual interpretation of Homer is to think that somehow pre-literate, oral-based or object-based cultures are incapable of the subtlety and sophistication that literate cultures are capable of. And my image in my mind that I have, I'm just starting to write a book about the sagas, the Icelandic sagas. And one picture I have of what Homer is like is one of those great Viking ships no known author, entirely a kind of joint cultural expression, deeply inherited, evolving over centuries, and making something as fine as has ever been made, of extraordinary grace, reality in the world, sense of power, and all sorts of qualities. And I think that you don't need to have a kind of Near Eastern civil service to make the shield of Achilles.
I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that. I'd just add that, of course, on that shield is not just rings, but 2 scenes, of course, literally fantastic, that any craftsman could have actually produced anything like it. And, of course, it's Hephaestus, the god, who produces it. But one is of a city at peace, one is a city at war. And remember, this is just before Achilles is about to take on Hector in total war. And so to have a city of peace, it actually backs up Adam's point about what Homer really, ideally would like. But it is also very sophisticated. I think it's a good deal more civilized than your Extremadura or whatever other analogies that you might wish to draw. But thanks very much. Great question. Lady in the second row.
Yeah, I have a feeling you're going to have different opinions about this, but you gave me a bit of reassurance saying that you didn't really like studying the language when you were at school, because so have I, but I did much better in the literature rather than the language, and I really love studying the culture and stuff. It's just I'm not particularly good at languages. So
right.
Do you know, I think you need to be old to do Homer. I now think that. That I can't think really why people think it's their stories for children.
Yeah.
They're not. They're stories of suffering.
Yeah.
And you only know that by the time you're my age.
But what about the notion of trying to get through the original language? Does that give you a different... It give you a different... I mean, have you actually been reading Homeric Greek?
I have.
Or Attic Greek?
I'm an A-level student, but one of my GCSE passages was a conversation between Hector and Andromache.
Right.
The other was Herodotus, but I did study Homeric.
Well, the thing about Homer is that language, the dialect, actually was never, ever spoken by any ordinary Greek ever anywhere. It's a purely literary confection. That's a very interesting fact. Its basis is one of the 3 main Greek dialects, Ionic Greek. And Herodotus is interesting because though he came from a city whose spoken language and written language was another dialect, Doric, he actually composed his histories in Ionic because Homer, his model, was principally based on the Ionic dialect. So actually Homeric Greek is extremely difficult when you first get at it because it's not the Greek that you're typically taught when you first start out, which is Athenian or Attic Greek. But thank you very much. You're going to persevere, I hope.
I just hope that,
Online Liddell and Scott.
Yeah.
It's the answer.
Oh, the panacea.
It is.
Panacea.
Thank you.
Do we have anybody else's hand up? Yes? No.
All the way back there's the man waving.
Or drowning.
And there's someone here. Yes.
Could you speak a little about Penelope, please?
Yes.
A Spartan woman, by the way.
Spartan woman. Yeah. He's a great promoter of Sparta.
Well, I'm an honorary citizen of modern Sparta. So I have to do my best for them. They weren't entirely nice.
Penelope is, I think, the hero of the Odyssey. That there's this wonderful word called, is it euegesia? Is that
Something
how you say
like
it?
that.
How do you say it?
That would work.
That will work.
Yeah.
Which means kind of good government as her great sort of, as her commanding quality, that she can organize the world around her, that she can keep these horrible people who want to go to bed with her at bay. She can control the flocks, the orchards. She can be very, very canny as Odysseus when he comes home, testing him, saying, "Why don't you put the bed outside, darling?" And he famously knows that the bed has one of its legs made of a living olive tree because he built it like that. And that is another model of epic too, really, that you take the old and make it into this kind of beautiful, homely thing, just as he made a raft earlier in the thing. And so she is just as equal a companion to him as he is to her. And she is commanding grace, beauty, and understanding. I think I would marry Penelope like a shot.
I think, sadly, the session has to end on that, and we'll talk later. Adam's now going to be doing a book signing, but thank you all for listening and participating.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.